Hi, students of Bible and Film. It's good to chat with you today a little bit more about the film Doubt, and especially about doubt and faith. And part of the reason that I am doing this is because it is, we've spent a lot of time talking about the gender dynamics, which are quite obvious in the movie Doubt, and about the characters of Sister Aloysius or Father Flynn. But in fact, the whole movie is about this idea of doubt and faith. And so since this is a class about religion and film, I thought it would be worthwhile to talk a little bit more about that particular emphasis of the movie. So I'm just going to go to the next slide. Here it is. What is faith is a really important part of this movie. What is faith? Because Sister Aloysius in some ways is the main character. And we don't tend to think about faith as faith in believing in something bad, but in fact, that's what happens in this movie. Sister Aloysius is convicted, almost completely convicted, that there is something inappropriate going on with the priest and the children. And that is a kind of a faith because it is portrayed as something for which she actually has no proof, but a strong conviction, a strong feeling of certainty. So what is faith? Is faith the absence of all doubt? Is it the working through of doubts? In other words, and in fact, this is a very live question for people of faith. Can you live with a lot of doubt and still consider yourself a faithful person? I personally think that you can. But the movie, in fact, portrays a case where faith for Sister Aloysius is an expression of her doubt. She has the two working together in her at the same time. Is it service to the powerless? In other words, is faith really an issue of justice? Which again, in this movie, it presents it as somewhat being so. Is it obedience to a higher authority no matter what? For much of the history of the Western Christian Church, at least, and in some other faiths as well, some other belief systems as well, what in fact is defined as faith is simply obedience. Sister Aloysius, Sister James as well, have vows of obedience that they are in fact working against, especially Sister Aloysius, by moving against an authority figure within her institution because of her belief that she owes that obedience to a higher power. So all of these things are going on in this movie all at once. It makes it very, very interesting. So some of the tensions in the movie, tension between young and old, a tension between male and female, which is quite obvious in the portrayals of the women on the one side, the nuns on the one side eating their austere dinner, and the priests on the other, enjoying themselves and drinking wine and laughing and smoking. A tension between conservative and progressive. Sister Aloysius is portrayed as being very conservative, whereas Father Flynn is portrayed as being progressive, but in a somewhat creepy way sometimes. But also there are tensions in the movie, of course, as we just said, between faith and doubt. And yet that may not be a real tension. It may be that doubt wraps into a properly expressed faith. There is certainly a tension between obedience to vows and concern for others. Sister Aloysius is concerned for, in this case, Donald, even though Donald may not be he may not be the true victim of this movie, or the play that it's based on. A tension between the appearance of empathy and warmth and perhaps predatory behavior. So Father Flynn is a much more likable person, at least presented at the beginning as a much more likable person than Sister Aloysius, but in the end, is he? So possible lenses through which to view doubt. Obviously, you can look at doubt through a gender lens and get all kinds of immediate feedback because of the differences between male and female and the power dynamics that are shown in this movie. But also there is a tension in terms of gender lens between different ways of being male. Father Flynn plays basketball, but he isn't necessarily, he's not a jock. And in fact, he points that out about himself, and sort of seems to portray a somewhat alternate masculinity. And perhaps he's gay. It's hard to tell, and that's not really what the movie is about. But it does show that there are different ways of being male and different ways of being female. Sister Aloysius as well. A decolonizing lens is one way to look through at this film. Because you have Donald being the first Black student in an otherwise white school, first African-American student in an otherwise Euro-American background school. And so that puts pressure on Donald, and it puts pressure on Sister Aloysius and on Father Flynn in terms of how they deal with Donald. And obviously there are issues around Donald's mother and family situation, which are maybe a bit of a trope as well in this movie. Theological lens, you can certainly view this through a theological lens. Faith and doubt, what are they and how should they be lived out? So the question is, if you have doubts, does that mean you're not a faithful person? Is Sister Aloysius just not a faithful person because she's going against her vows as well? Hard to say. You can look at this film through a historical critical lens, and that is one that we haven't specifically talked about that much in the past, but it is also a lens to look at, one that we tend to use quite a bit, a historical critical lens. In this particular case, the film is set in the 1960s. The cars are old, the people are dressed differently from the way they are now, and the situation of integration is very different from now. But at the same time, the attention to possible abuse and to integration are concerns that actually arise decades later. So the movie, when you look at it through a historical critical lens, you go, yes, these things were happening, but we are looking from a different perspective back onto the 1960s, New York City, the Bronx in the 1960s, and bringing contemporary concerns to a portrayal of an earlier time. You can look at this through a Marxist lens. Who's rich, who's poor? You can see at the very beginning who seem to be some fairly wealthy people who are bringing their children to school. And Donald is portrayed as being raised in a poorer family where this is an opportunity for him to move ahead economically and socially. You can look at it through an aesthetic or a film studies lens. There is some really interesting camera work that goes on at the beginning of the sermon, which looks up at Father Flynn, and the picture, the stained glass, or sometimes the cross, is behind Father Flynn. And the picture is also of Sister Aloysius, of Meryl Streep, extremely striking sometimes. So there's some very interesting camera angles. You pay attention to the use of light, and also the actor's body movements during the confrontation in the office. All you have to do, you could turn the sound right off and watch the way the actors are moving. Father Flynn takes Sister Aloysius's chair during that little confrontation at first, and then is moved out of it. And that chair represents authority. And all of that stuff is done without any, you can see it happening even without dialogue. And that's how important body movement is in many films, and especially in this one. So an aesthetic film studies lens notices that. How do we express our faith with our bodies? How do we express confrontation or the opposite of it? How do we express community and friendship and love through our bodies? And how is that portrayed in a film? So again, I just want to point out, I want to again remind you that the slant of a movie, that is the lens or the particular subjects that the movie is interested in portraying. So in this case, it's interested in portraying racial dynamics, it's interested in portraying doubt and faith, it's interested in portraying gender dynamics as well. But that is the message of the film. And remember that is not the same as the hermeneutic of the viewer. So hermeneutics and lenses belong to us viewing a movie, and movies very often, almost always, have a particular slant or a message that they also are trying to portray. So a lens belongs to us, the other belongs to the movie itself. It's important to be aware of both our lenses and practice trying on other lenses, but also the message being pushed by the movie, with which we may agree or not. So some of the conflicts in the film, note the differences between the priests and the nuns having dinner, as I mentioned. Notice Father Flynn's special attention to Donald, but also Sister Aloysius' special attention to Donald. The poor kid is the subject, is sort of the lightning rod for their power conflict. And is that right or not? It's hard to say. And basically, it comes back to an issue of justice and also of people being differently enabled in certain situations or in others. So if our concern is justice, which is an ethical issue, does that mean treating everyone equally, as Sister Aloysius says, or giving more opportunities to some, as Father Flynn seems to hint? Which of those is actually more just and equitable? And notice that Sister Aloysius lectures Donald's mother, Mrs. Miller, at one point, saying, "What kind of mother are you?" And you can certainly see what's called intersectionality here, where to be African-American in the 1960s was one thing, but then to be essentially a mother who's doing all of the work on her own, as portrayed in this film, adds another layer of complication and of oppression to a situation that was already fraught and difficult. And Sister Aloysius does not necessarily seem aware of that, while Father Flynn does, which is one of the complications of this film. Sister Aloysius, Sister James, Donald, Father Flynn. Sister Aloysius's investigation of Father Flynn begins right away, and that's why his opening sermon is about doubt. Is there room in her faith for doubt? Is there room in a life of obedience and vows for going up against the authority? How much can we buck the system, and how much should we, if we are being ethical? Notice that there are motives given to Sister Aloysius as becoming a nun. She had lived a life outside of the nunnery before, and she's presented as somebody who has some experience of the world. And contrast that to Sister James, who is portrayed as being a kind of a naive young nun. If Donald might actually be gay, is Father Flynn simply showing that there are masculinities other than the usual image of men from the 1960s? So Father Flynn is obviously not a cowboy or an astronaut or some of those other tropes of masculinity from the 1960s, or an athlete particularly. So how might he also be portraying other masculinities? The film, in the end, refuses to answer the questions, and that's an important point. And maybe that is the definition of faith, that we have to choose a course without actually knowing for sure what's at the other end. A little bit like Truman at the very beginning in the first movie we saw, where he was sailing that boat without really knowing where he was going. Can you imagine just sailing the boat out and away? And that is, again, and for that makers of that movie, of The Truman Show, as here, the idea of uncertainty is wrapped into faith. Sometimes we take the leap, what Kierkegaard called the leap of faith, or venture into the unknown, not really knowing what comes next. And so this movie refuses to answer the questions. It's a dark movie, and it is a difficult movie. Well, a lot of the movies we're watching this term are, but I think it does certainly repay some thinking about doubt and faith, and whether they really are opposites or maybe they're complementary. Thanks a lot. Looking forward to chatting with you some more soon about this and other movies.